Eddie Murphy's sprawling Long Island estate always seemed like the picture of serenity. Manicured lawns, a shimmering pool, and a driveway so long it felt like entering another world. But behind the grandeur was a story that Eddie himself never thought he'd believe until it happened to him. It began one summer night in 2007. Eddie had just returned home from a late-night shoot. Exhausted, he settled into his favorite chair in the living room, a space adorned with priceless artwork and personal photographs. The house was silent, his kids were with their mother, and the staff had gone home. That's when it started. The heavy oak door to the study swung open with a creak. Eddie looked up, expecting to see someone, but no one was there. He dismissed it as a draft, though he knew the air conditioning was off. Minutes later, a loud thud echoed from the upstairs hallway. He froze, his heart racing. Gathering his courage, he climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. At the end of the hall, a family portrait had fallen from the wall, the glass shattered. Eddie knelt to inspect it, but something made him glance over his shoulder. There, at the far end of the corridor, a shadow darted past the doorway. He bolted back downstairs, trying to convince himself he'd imagined it. Weeks passed, but the incidents only escalated. Doors slammed shut without warning. Lights flickered even after electricians declared the wiring flawless. One night, Eddie awoke to the sound of laughter, children's laughter. It echoed through the house, though his kids were nowhere near Long Island. He followed the sound to the basement, where it stopped abruptly. The room was empty, but the faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, a scent he didn't recognize. Determined to uncover the truth, Eddie invited his close friend Mike, a skeptic, to spend the weekend. On the second night, they sat in the kitchen, talking over coffee, when the chandelier above them began to sway. "Earthquake," Mike joked, but the smirk faded when the room grew cold. A chilling breeze swept past them, strong enough to extinguish the candle on the table. The next morning, Mike refused to stay another night. "There's something in this house, Eddie," he admitted. "I don't know what it is, but I'm not sticking around to find out." The turning point came when Eddie's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Gray, shared her story. She revealed that she'd heard whispers in the hallways, indistinct, urgent voices speaking a language she didn't recognize. She swore she'd seen a woman in a long dress standing by the piano one night, only to vanish when approached. Eddie decided to dig into the property's history. What he found chilled him to the bone. The land once belonged to the Witherstone family, who lived there in the 1800s. According to old records, the eldest daughter, Eliza, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors claimed to hear her cries long after the family moved away, but no one dared investigate. Eddie brought in a paranormal investigator, a man named Dr. Malcolm Hayes. Armed with cameras and recording devices, Dr. Hayes spent the night in the house. The footage he captured was unsettling. Doors slamming on their own, faint whispers caught on audio, and, most disturbingly, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of Eddie's bed as he slept. The next morning, Eddie knew he couldn't stay. Within months, he sold the house and moved to Los Angeles. To this day, he refuses to talk about the mansion in interviews. When pressed, he only says, "There are things that happen in this world we'll never understand." The house remains vacant. Locals whisper about the eerie glow in its windows at night, and some claim to hear laughter echoing from the empty halls. Whether it's the Witherstone family or something else entirely, one thing is certain: Eddie Murphy's Long Island estate is a place no one wants to call home. Eddie's departure didn't bring peace to the house. In fact, it seemed to stir something deeper within its walls. Months after Eddie moved out, the mansion's new owner, a hedge fund manager named David Hale, moved in with his wife, Lindsay, and their teenage daughter, Emma. They'd gotten the property at a steal, brushing off the rumors as silly ghost stories. But their confidence began to waver almost immediately. On their first night, Emma complained about hearing someone humming in her room. David and Lindsay laughed it off, blaming the stress of the move. But Emma's claims didn't stop. By the third night, she refused to sleep in her room, insisting she'd seen a woman in the corner, her face shadowed and her hands clasped as if in prayer. Meanwhile, Lindsay began noticing small things: a vase on the mantel turned slightly askew, the faint scent of lavender in the hallway, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She dismissed it at first, but one afternoon, as she unpacked boxes in the living room, she heard a faint whisper. "Leave." She froze, her hands trembling. The word was soft but unmistakable, as if spoken directly into her ear. When she turned, the room was empty. Lindsay told herself she was imagining things, but the unease began to grow. David, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes at their concerns. "Old houses creak," he said, "and lavender is probably in the air ducts." To prove his point, he invited a team of contractors to inspect the place. They found nothing unusual until one of the men refused to go back into the basement. "It's not right down there," he muttered as he packed up his tools. "You couldn't pay me enough to stay in this house." Curiosity got the better of David that night. With a flashlight in hand, he descended into the basement. It was colder than he expected, the air damp and heavy. At the far end of the room, something caught his eye: a small wooden door he hadn't noticed before. It was locked, and the paint around the edges was chipped, as if someone or something had tried to claw their way in. When David finally pried it open, he found a cramped space lined with old bricks and cobwebs. In the center of the room was a single, small chair, the wood warped with age. Resting on it was an old photograph. David held it up to the light. It was a family portrait, faded but unmistakable. A stern-looking man, a woman in a high-necked dress, and 3 children. One of them, a girl with dark curls and piercing eyes, looked eerily familiar. That night, David had the first dream. He was standing in a field, the sky bruised with storm clouds. In the distance, he saw the little girl from the photograph. She stood motionless, staring at him, her lips moving as if she were whispering something. He strained to hear, but a sudden clap of thunder drowned her out. David woke with a start, his heart pounding. For the first time, he wondered if the stories about the house might be true. But he couldn't let Lindsay or Emma see his fear. Instead, he brushed it off, attributing the dream to the stress of the move. But deep down, he knew something was coming, and it wasn't finished with them yet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. David couldn't shake the image of the girl in the photograph. Her eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went, burning into the edges of his thoughts. He began spending more time in the basement, staring at the photograph, running his fingers over its cracked surface, and wondering how it ended up behind a locked door. He didn't tell Lindsay. She was already jumpy, and Emma barely slept through the night. But the house didn't wait for David to figure things out. It began making itself known in ways that were impossible to ignore. One morning, Emma woke to find her mirror covered in streaks. At first, she thought it was condensation, but as she looked closer, the streaks formed words. Backward, like a faint smudge pressed from the other side of the glass. It read, "She's watching." Emma screamed, bringing Lindsay running. When Lindsay saw the mirror, she tried to scrub the words away, but no matter how hard she wiped, the streaks wouldn't fade. That night, she insisted they all sleep in the same room. David tried to act calm, but the cracks in his confidence were growing. He spent hours online, researching the Witherstone family, piecing together fragments of their history. He learned that Eliza, the girl in the photograph, was the eldest daughter and had been accused of witchcraft by the townspeople before her mysterious disappearance. Her family maintained she had run away, but whispered rumors hinted at something much darker. One night, as he sat in the dim light of the study, poring over old documents he'd found online, David heard a faint knock. Not at the door, but behind him on the window. His blood ran cold. The study was on the 2nd floor. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Outside, illuminated by the moonlight, was the faint outline of a figure. Small, slight, a girl. David blinked, and she was gone. The next day, Lindsay confronted him. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "Emma's having nightmares, and I can't stop feeling like we're being watched." David hesitated, torn between his skepticism and the undeniable fear creeping into his own mind. Just give me a little more time, he said. I need to figure out what's happening here. That evening, they decided to leave for the night, booking a hotel to escape the oppressive weight of the house. But as they were packing, the power went out. The mansion fell into darkness, and a low, guttural hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. Lindsay clutched Emma, whispering, "What is that?" David grabbed his flashlight and cautiously made his way to the foyer. The humming grew louder, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing against his chest. Then, all at once, the chandelier above him shattered, raining glass onto the marble floor. In the chaos, Emma screamed, pointing toward the staircase. At the top, barely visible in the flickering beam of David's flashlight, stood the girl from the photograph. Her head tilted slightly, her lips moving silently, as though she were chanting. The temperature plummeted. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the girl's face twisted not into anger, but into something far worse. A silent, mournful scream. And then she was gone. When the lights flickered back on, Lindsay grabbed David by the arm. "We're leaving. Tonight." But as they turned to the door, they froze. Scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, were 4 words they hadn't noticed before. "You cannot leave me." They never made it to the hotel. The house wasn't letting them go. David stared at the scratched words on the door, his mind reeling. Lindsay, trembling, clutched Emma tightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it want, David? What does she want?" "I don't know," he muttered, his own voice shaking. "But we're not staying here." He grabbed the car keys and headed for the front door, determined to leave the house behind for good. But as he turned the knob, the door refused to budge. It felt as though an invisible force held it shut, the weight of 1,000 hands pressing against it. David yanked harder, and then harder still, until the wood groaned under the strain, but it wouldn't open. Behind him, Emma screamed again. David spun around to see her staring at the grand staircase. Slowly, with a deep creak, the wooden steps began to warp and shift, bending upward as though something massive and unseen was pushing from beneath. "Dad, what is that?" Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. David didn't answer. He couldn't. The air grew heavier, thick with an energy that seemed alive. Lindsay clutched Emma's hand and pulled her toward the back door. "There's another way out. The kitchen," she shouted. But when they reached it, the sight stopped them cold. Every cabinet door hung wide open, their contents shattered across the floor. Knives from the magnetic strip were embedded in the walls at strange angles, as if hurled with incredible force. The windows, too, had transformed. Instead of the backyard, they now reflected something else entirely. A dense, dark forest that stretched endlessly under a blood-red sky. David felt a chill run through him. He wasn't looking at his yard anymore. This isn't real," he whispered, trying to convince himself. But the smell of pine and damp earth seeped through the glass as if the forest were alive on the other side. Then came the sound. It began as a faint tapping like raindrops on glass, but quickly grew louder, sharper. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the reflection of the forest. A silhouette emerged in the window. A figure in a long dress, her face obscured. She pressed her hands against the glass, her fingers pale and unnaturally long. Slowly, she leaned closer until her face was inches from theirs. Lindsay screamed as the figure opened her mouth, impossibly wide, and the tapping turned into a deafening pounding. "Run!" David shouted, grabbing their arms and pulling them back into the living room. They sprinted upstairs, unsure of where else to go. As they reached the second floor, the humming from before returned, louder and more intense. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the sound. Doors slammed open and shut on their own, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable cold. David led them into the master bedroom, slamming the door behind them. He locked it, though deep down he knew it wouldn't stop whatever was out there. They huddled in the corner, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Emma buried her face in Lindsay's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message. He fumbled to unlock it, desperate for a lifeline, for anything to bring them back to reality. The message was from an unknown number. "Look in the closet." David stared at the screen, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he raised his eyes to the walk-in closet at the far side of the room. The door was ajar, just a crack, but it was enough to see the darkness beyond. "No," Lindsay whispered, clutching his arm. "Don't you dare." David didn't respond. He felt drawn to it, as if the message wasn't a warning but a command. He stood, his legs trembling, and took a cautious step forward. As he reached the closet, the humming stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. He placed a trembling hand on the door and pulled it open. Inside, the space was empty except for the chair. The same small, warped chair he had found in the basement. On it sat the photograph of the Witherstone family, but now something was different. Eliza's face had changed. She was no longer looking at the camera. She was staring directly at David, her eyes wide, her mouth twisted into a chilling grin. And then, from behind him, he heard her voice. "You should have stayed away." David spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs, but the room was empty. Lindsay and Emma sat frozen in the corner, their faces pale, staring at something just behind him. Lindsay's voice was barely audible. He didn't dare turn back. The air was electric, thick with a presence he could feel but couldn't see. The voice came again, closer this time, soft and lilting. "You didn't listen." A sudden force ripped through the room, throwing David against the wall. The photograph flew from his hands, landing face up in the center of the floor. Eliza's grin in the picture grew wider, her eyes more manic, as if feeding off the chaos. The humming returned, louder and more oppressive than ever. Emma screamed as the bedroom door slammed open. The hallway was now a swirling void of darkness, pulsing like a living thing. From within the void, shadowy figures began to emerge, elongated, misshapen, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Run!" David shouted, scrambling to his feet. But there was nowhere to run. The shadows poured into the room, filling every corner. Lindsay held Emma tightly, her sobs drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that filled the air. David grabbed a lamp and swung it wildly, but his hands passed through the figures like smoke. "Stop!" he shouted, though he didn't know who or what he was pleading with. In the chaos, Eliza's voice rose above the whispers, cold and resolute. "You took what wasn't yours. Now you will pay." The room began to shake violently. The walls cracked, and the floor beneath them splintered as if the house itself were alive, ready to swallow them whole. David's eyes darted to the photograph still lying on the floor. He lunged for it, a desperate idea forming in his mind. "Is this what you want?" he shouted, holding the picture up. The shadows froze. The whispers stopped. Eliza's figure materialized at the edge of the void, her face now fully visible. Her eyes were sunken, her skin ashen, and her lips curled into a sneer. She pointed a bony finger at David. "It was never yours to find." David realized then this wasn't about them. It was about the chair, the photograph, the secret hidden within the house for so long. They had awakened something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. "Take it," he shouted, throwing the photograph into the void. "Take it and leave us alone." The shadows swirled around the picture, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Eliza's figure faded, her voice a faint echo as she whispered, "You should have stayed away." The room returned to stillness. The air lightened, the temperature rising to normal. The cracks in the walls vanished, and the oppressive darkness receded, leaving only the faint smell of lavender. Lindsay and Emma stared at David, wide-eyed. "Is it over?" Lindsay asked, her voice trembling. David didn't answer. He picked up the photograph, now blank, its image wiped clean. He knew the house wasn't finished with them, not really. The next day, they packed what they could and left, abandoning the mansion and everything in it. Months later, the property went back on the market, its new owners unaware of the horrors it held. But David couldn't forget. Even now, in the quiet of their new home, he sometimes hears it, the faint hum, the smell of lavender, and the echo of Eliza's whisper. "You should have stayed away." The mansion on Long Island still stands, waiting for its next guests. And somewhere in its depths, the little girl with the piercing eyes is still watching, still waiting for those who dare to disturb her slumber. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.